Please give a warm welcome to the host of Broadway Buzz, Mr. Joe Gary.
Welcome to Broadway Buzz. I'm Joe Gary, and you're in for a magnificent treat. I hope you're wearing your marching boots because you're going to be inspired, you're going to be inflamed, and you're going to be amazed at what you didn't know about American history. But this show is so much more than that. It has an extraordinary score, a very dense lyric that is spectacular. It gives you so much information in so little time. The music is so contemporary. It takes the issues of another time. This show deals with the passage of the 19th Amendment, giving women the rights to vote. This, of course, would happen in 1920. The span of this show goes from 1913 to 1920. But remember, the fight started much earlier. It all started in 1848 when there was a meeting at Seneca Falls, New York, and Susan B. Anthony and Lucretia Mott proclaimed the idea, the outrageous idea, that women should be given the right to vote. So it took all that time from 1848 to 1920 to make it happen. But remember, what happened in 1920 is that white women were given the right to vote. And actually, initially, it was women 30 years old and older. So it would take many years. I mean, we would move to 1965 before the Equal Rights Amendment was passed, and black women and Native American women were given the right to vote. So this is an extraordinary journey. Let me introduce you to the brilliant young woman who created this work. Her name is Shaina Taub. Remember that name. I mean, she's a superstar. She would write the book, the lyrics, the music, and she would star in the original Off-Broadway version and Broadway version of Suffs. A remarkable talent. She was born in Vermont. As a young child, she was in love with the theater, and she went to theater camps. When she was in the second grade, she wrote an ode to Broadway. And the very touching thing is, in her dressing room, when she played the show in New York, that old piece of art was framed on her wall, and the ode to Broadway really came true for Shaina Taub. She would study at New York University, and she would have as her mentor Liz Swados. Elizabeth Swados was really the first great American woman to become a major composer on Broadway. She would do a remarkable show called Runaways, which was very improvisational. She worked with kids from the streets in New York and created this remarkable show, and she would be one of the first women to be represented on Broadway as a composer. And she would very strongly influence Shaina Taub and her work. Let us go to the beginning and see the background here, because there's stuff I want to tell you that's sort of before the curtain goes up, and then things I want you to know about after the curtain comes down. So let us begin with the movement, the feminist movement. It really started in England. So in the early 1900s, there was a remarkable woman named Emmeline Pankhurst, and she had 3 daughters, and they would become the first great feminists. In their fight for the right to vote in England, they moved very strongly and very aggressively. Remember, this is a period where women had a very diminutive role in society. They were there to be mothers, keepers of the family home, raising the children, and no one expected them to be raising hell in the streets like Emmeline Pankhurst was doing. Her theory about getting the right to vote was not to ask politely, but to demand. And she, of course, would be successful in making that happen in England. I just want you to know, if you're keeping track of female rights, it would be New Zealand that would be the first country that would give women the right to vote. And the southern part of Australia also did that very early on. But other countries, would take years to make it happen, half a century to make it happen. So let me introduce the heroine of our show. Her name is Alice Paul. All the women I'm going to be talking about are historic figures, and they would be the women who would play a major role not only in achieving the rights for women to vote, but will be, in fact, the stars of our show. So the protagonist of our show is Alice Paul. In real life, Alice Paul was born a Quaker. Now, remember, in the Quaker religion, there is this very strong sense of equality. And so from the time she was born, Alice understood that women were equal to men. This she found in her religion, in her community, and so she was imbued with this sense that all women should have this power in the world. I mean, keep in mind, women couldn't make any decisions. I mean, much worse than not being able to vote. They couldn't hire a lawyer. They couldn't enter into business negotiations. They were totally dependent on being, really a part of a family dominated by the husband and the male influence. So it would be Alice Paul in her very civilized Quaker upbringing that made her realize that everyone was equal. She was an extraordinary student. She went to Swarthmore. Even at a very early age, she took very strong positions about everything. She went to Europe to study. And while she was there, this was the period of the Emmeline Pankhurst craze, and she became so enamored of this woman with such power who didn't politely ask for the rights to vote. She demanded the rights to vote. And so she became very involved in all of the demonstrations that happened in England in the period. One of the key things that Emmeline Pankhurst liked to do was to be exceedingly disruptive. Alice would borrow all of these devices when she would come back to America. But one of the things Emmeline liked to do was to break windows to get attention. And then she would speak in front of the broken storefront window. So our Alice, in this case, would break 48 windows. She was very proud of that. And she would end up being put in jail. Now, keep in mind, the other thing that happened with Emmeline Pankhurst, to get attention while she was in jail, the ladies would go on hunger strikes, and then they would be force-fed. It was exceedingly brutal. But keep in mind, Alice Paul would borrow all of these devices so that when she came back to America, she had all these extraordinary sort of radical tools to work to get attention and ultimately help win the rights for women to vote. Okay, so Alice Paul suffers being imprisoned. She suffers the hunger strikes, the being force-fed. She comes back to America, and this is where our musical is going to begin. So the time is 1913, and she organizes one of the greatest marches, protest marches, in the history of protest in any form. And she decided to do it, very clever timing. This was an extraordinary woman. Keep in mind, I just want you to know that as an academic, she worked on a PhD, but she also worked on a law degree. She was so anxious to have her law degree that she enrolled in 2 law universities so she could finish faster. This was a woman on a march. This was a woman with a mission. And everything was geared to giving her the tools to being able to help women get the rights to vote. So the time is 1913, and she organizes the first great protest in Washington, D.C. She would get a permit so that they could march down Pennsylvania Avenue. Keep in mind how many thousands of protest events have subsequently marched down that avenue to go right past the White House and make their position very clear. But keep in mind, Alice Paul had brilliant timing. And she also understood that she was picking March 3rd, 1913, to do this. It was the day before Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. Poor Woodrow Wilson arrived in Washington, hoping the day before, on the day of the parade, actually, hoping that, he would be surrounded by the media and adoring fans, and no one was at the train station to meet him because everyone was lining up on Pennsylvania Avenue. Over 200,000 people lined Pennsylvania Avenue to watch this parade. And Alice was able to generate 8,000 women to march. And these women came from every state in the United States. They were highly educated, they were socialites, they were factory workers. Everyone was there. Girl Scout troops, everyone was there. Sororities, everyone was there to march. What would happen, and you will see this being developed all through the first act of the show. It's an extraordinary moment. But what would happen is there would be a demonstration, and the men watching it were so angry that women were outrageously asking for the right to vote. The men realized that the world order would significantly change if this ever happened. So they tried to stop the parade. Now, Alice Paul did a brilliant thing, and let me introduce one of the other spectacular women who were part of her entourage. Her name is Inez Milholland. And Inez Milholland was a beauty. She was a socialite. She was sexually liberated. Keep in mind, this is 1913, and she believed in free love, and she was extremely intelligent. She would be one of the first women to have a law degree. She was a brilliant orator, but also she was a wonderful showman. And so she decided that since she was going to lead the parade, everyone was going to be wearing white. She decided that she would ride on a white horse, and she would wear armor like the great Greek goddesses did, so in white and Greek armor. So, I mean, talk about stopping a show. Inez Milholland certainly knew how to do it. She is a central character in the first act, and we become very attached to her. But in that parade then, a riot almost happened, and they had to bring in mounted police to stop it from happening. But what it did do, keep in mind, the world press was there. So, it was reported all over the world. Number one, it was the first great protest parade on Pennsylvania Avenue. And then second of all, it was proclaiming the idea of women's rights and demanding the rights to vote, and being done with 8,000 women dressed in white. This is spectacular. So watch how all this is developed in the first act of the show. It's really spectacular and beautifully done and beautifully staged. Okay, so some other key names for you as you from history that you will see developed then in the show. We have Carrie Chapman Catt. This was a great lady. She is an old matriarch. She had been in the cause since the time of Susan B. Anthony in 1848. Her approach to this was sending scented letters to Congress saying, please consider giving us the right to vote. Writing to the president saying, could I please have tea with you to discuss it? So her approach was very genteel. Her approach was based on a generational idea of what women should be in that period. Subdued, polite, perfectly mannered, asking in the politest possible way. So these two women then, Alice Paul and Carrie Chapman Catt, will become the protagonist and antagonist. We will see these two women basically wanting the same thing, the right to vote, but wanting to get it in very different ways. Watch how this unfolds. We meet them at the very beginning of the show, and their relationship is developed through the whole show. It is very antagonistic, of course, because Alice Paul cannot be subdued. She has been imbued with this passion to make this happen for women. But some other key figures you're going to see both from history and then in the show. Ida B. Wells, a black woman who was born into slavery. She was one of the first black women to be educated. She would become a teacher, but much more importantly, she would become a journalist. And not only did she become a journalist, she opened her own newspaper. A black woman owning a newspaper, writing about the atrocities of what were happening in the post-Civil War South, especially with the lynchings. Her life was always put in danger when she wrote these very inflammatory articles. So she is a heroine in our story. But again, it's another story. Remember, this is a story about gender. This is a story about generations, and this is a story about race. And remember, Southern women at this time, the last thing they wanted was to have black women have the rights to vote. So watch how all of these issues come together in the telling of this story. And then one of my favorite characters in this story is Róża Wenclawska. And she is a Polish immigrant, feisty, outrageous. She came to America. She worked as a child in factories, so she understood the horror of the abuse of children in the factory system. When she was 17 years old, she had tuberculosis, and for 2 years in the sanitarium had to have bed rest. But in that period, she became one of the experts in America on labor relations. So when she got out, she worked very strongly for factory workers, and then she took on this cause of women's rights. She's very colorful. You will love her in the story. And we constantly see these juxtapositions of great socialites then meeting socialists in the sense of Róża. She's a very colorful character. The other thing I want to tell you about her is in 1920, after they did receive the rights to vote, she left the movement and she decided to reinvent herself. So, I mean, she went from being an immigrant, she went from working in the factories to becoming an expert on law, to becoming then an actress. And she would work with one of the greatest acting companies America ever had, the Provincetown Playhouse, and she would work with Eugene O'Neill. There's a wonderful moment at the end, in her exit at the end of the second act. She says to the audience, "You should look me up on Google because I became an actress." Well, now I'm telling you what she did. She had an extraordinary career with an extraordinary acting company, and once again, she invented herself in the true spirit of immigrants finding their way in America. And then finally, my final favorite character is Alva Belmont. Alva Belmont is an old matriarch. She's rich, she's powerful, and she really subsidizes the whole movement. And what happened was, first of all, she was married to a Vanderbilt. He was a philanderer. She divorced him in one of the first social divorces of the day. It would be Alva, then Vanderbilt, who would make the Vanderbilt name socially acceptable. She would not simply new money, but she would make them a fabric of the American culture. She would build some of the greatest mansions in New York and in Newport. She would also build them in the south of France. She was an amazing woman, and she's very colorfully developed in the story. Watch her wonderful musical number near the end of the first act. And she plays the great matron with great effect. Okay, so we have this body of extraordinary people. And isn't it ironic? We somehow sit here. I think one of the things that every audience member does is they say, how did I not know any of this? How did I not know any of these extraordinary women? I ended up reading 5 biographies of these women in preparation for this. They're just so compelling. And it's so embarrassing to realize that in our culture, they never became heroes. And think of all of the other amendments that have been passed where nameless people were responsible for giving us our basic rights. Okay, so let's go to then the creation of this show. Let me introduce Rachel Sussman. Rachel Sussman is one of the lead producers of the show. When you read the program, you see now how many producers it takes to make a show happen on Broadway. But Rachel Sussman, when she was in middle school, wrote in her journal that she was going to become a Broadway producer and she was going to create a musical about the suffragist movement. And so she did. So she took Shaina Taub to lunch, asking her to become the composer-lyricist of her idea. And she gave her a book that was called Jailed for Freedom, which was an account of the suffragist movement. It was written by Doris Stevens. Pay careful attention to this, because Doris Stevens is a bespectacled young girl in the story you're going to see who is the secretary to the group. And through the whole time, she keeps notes on the whole process. And at the end of the story that we see in our musical, she says to Alice, I'm going off to write a book about this experience. And so she does. And the book is called Jailed for Freedom. So if you want to read one book that sort of gives you a summary of these women and the events that happened, that's the book to look at. It's been recently re-edited, and it's a very easy read. When it was given to Shaina Taub, she went home from the meeting and read it all in one night. And she was determined then to do this musical, which would take her 10 years to do. Let me just tell you why Rachel Sussman took Shaina Taub to lunch and why she picked her to write the book. Shaina Taub, when she graduated from New York University, had a very close association with the Public Theater in New York. It's on Lafayette Street in New York. It was created by Joseph Papp, over 70 years ago. It's one of the great Off-Broadway theaters, one of the great theaters of the world. And they have a summer program where they do Shakespeare in the Park in New York. And in any case, Shaina Taub was hired over a several-year period to create 2 new musicals for Shakespeare in the Park. One was Shakespeare's Twelfth Night, and the other was Shakespeare's As You Like It. And so not only did she adapt these works so that they became very contemporary and very acceptable to a wide modern audience, but she wrote an extraordinary score and extraordinary lyrics for the work. And also, Shaina Taub starred in both of those productions. So by the time our producer is taking her to lunch, she is a known commodity. And in New York, she is considered the next rising star, a young woman who's a composer, lyricist, who writes very tuneful music, who also is a very skilled and accomplished actress. So Shaina Taub would then spend 10 years creating this work. This work had 9 workshops. It started with Shaina Taub, and very early on, again, the producers were very smart, they hired the director, Lee Silverman. Lee Silverman, a woman who had graduated from Carnegie Mellon, who came to New York as a young artist and directed one of my favorite chamber musicals, Violet. And so, she's had a long career in New York, developing a lot of shows, especially in the small off-Broadway theaters. But Lee Silverman is a masterful director, as you will see. She creates a very seamless production. It's like you're literally watching a march for 2 hours, but it's so beautifully done. Scenery constantly moving, people always moving in elliptical circles and things. Beautifully executed. So she would work with Shaina Taub from the very beginning. They would sit at a piano. Shaina Taub, a great journey. I mean, she's a maniac in the way she works. She devours material. She read everything she could possibly read about this period. There is something I want to recommend for you. I really want you to consider doing this. Now, there is, if you go to YouTube and just type in Grammy Museum and then put Shaina Taub's name, what will come up is a 1-hour interview with Shaina Taub where she sits at the piano and shows you how she found the sound for this show, how she found the words for this show, how she tweaked the music in this show. She's a remarkable artist. And I have had the opportunity of working on original musicals, and I have worked with composers, but I learned much more from watching this 1 hour. So invest this 1 hour. Go to Grammy Museum /Shaina Taub, and you will be delighted when you see the magic of how Shaina Taub created her work. She started with about 5 actresses, New York actresses, who sat around the piano with her, and they sort of assigned character roles. So very early on, an actress knew she was playing Ida B. Wells. Very early on, an actress knew she was playing Carrie, the matriarch, who started the movement in a very generational way. So these women would sit around the piano, and not only did they help with the creation of music and listen to the complexity of the lyrics in this show. These are very dense lyrics. I had the pleasure, as I always do, of reading the script. And in this case, when you read the script without music, you realize the power of the lyrics. They're so dense in meaning. They have so much responsibility. You remember the musical Parade. That also used that idea. Same thing is true in Hamilton, where there's great density in the language of the music. And so this happens in this show. So by watching that video, you will have a very profound appreciation for who Shaina Taub is. So in any case, they would work 10 years on this project. As I told you, there would be 9 major workshops of the show, always making major and important changes in the process. Finally, the show would open at the Public Theater in New York. It opened to rave reviews. But when the show closed, again, there was a time period. There was a 2-year time period. The show opened at the public in 2022. It opened on Broadway in 2024. And what she did, even though it was a very successful show, they went back and did 2 major workshops. They changed the opening number. They created a new number in the first act of the show that's a great hit. It's called The Great American Bitch. How I love to say that on camera. And in any case, it's a remarkable song about how the men treated the women who were in this organization at the time. So in any case, when the show opened in New York, it had rave reviews. And then again, here we have this woman who not only writes the music, the lyrics, and the book, but she also then stars in the show. A couple moments I want you to watch for in the show. The story is so wonderfully, easily told. You find out so much about characters. There are 17 people on the stage. It's really an ensemble. It's more like a Greek chorus than it is a traditional Broadway chorus. But we get to know these people so dimensionally. I went and read, all these biographies, And if you watch the show, you come away with a very clear understanding who each of these women were. So Shaina Taub is not only exerting great brilliance as a composer and lyricist, but she's clearly a wonderful storyteller. And she's clearly able to take these complex women who have very different points of view. Almost everyone has an opposite in the story. So you watch Ida B. Wells, who is this black woman who speaks for black rights, and she wants the freedom now. They deserve it now. And then there's another black woman in the story, Mary Terrell, who is much more passive in the way she works. So watch how these characters have built-in antagonisms. They love one another, they respect one another, but they have to move in different directions. The show ends with one of the most rousing numbers in a musical. It's called Keep Marching. And, when we watch this show, we realize that we're not only looking at something that happened in 1920, we're looking at something that's happening today. And voting rights are still in jeopardy. And so my message to you is keep marching.